All right, so that's the latest from the Walter Sisulu University. Just yesterday, a group of disgruntled students from Wits University embarked on a protest march. They are demanding that the university provide free accommodation for students who cannot afford to pay for it on their own. However, the university says most of the students who are protesting failed repeatedly and have lost their funding and accommodation as a result. The South African Union of Students says the conversation around student accommodation is the next big thing that will shock the sector post the fees must fall activism. Thabo Shingange is the organization's spokesperson and he joins us now live. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so let's start right here. Wits University, your take on what happened yesterday and the concerns really from the students.
Look, I think the issue around Wits University needs us to take a step back in terms of looking holistically at the issue of student accommodation. Now, let's declassify the term. There's student accommodation crisis, which I don't think is the case at Wits. And then there's a student affordability crisis, which might be the situation.
What's the difference between the two?
The difference. So mostly in your historically white universities, those universities which are located primarily in the metro areas, you have your accommodation around the university charging exorbitant amounts. I mean, amounts like 6.5, 6,000, 7,000 rand in some instances. And now you find that when you find students sleeping in the library, it's not because the beds in and of themselves are fully occupied. You find that there are beds that are empty from January right through to December. But students cannot afford this 6.5 in this particular situation. Whereas where you have accommodation crises, for instance, your University of Venda, where you find 10 students sharing a single room because there's lack of rooms to expand to the entire student populace. So we need to begin to give this nuance. Why am I saying we must give this nuance? Because when we begin to look at it from an affordability perspective, we then begin to call in different stakeholders to look into some of the solutions that are affecting students. So for instance, in this case of Wits, we need to be able to look at government and say, what is government doing to regulate?
Well, but from what the
university
has been saying is that these are the students who had lost funding and their accommodation as a result of failing their courses repeatedly.
Yeah, but a student is going to fail if they are sleeping in the library, as you've seen with the videos that are circulating. Those students are not going to be able to study.
But they had accommodation previously, from our understanding.
But
it's been taken away from them as a result of failing.
Yeah, but the conditions, you see, when you say students are failing, what are the conditions in which these students are failing? Surely if a student is getting accommodation in May, in April, in June, in July, those are approaching semester tests. Currently, as you speak, there are semester tests. There are assignments that are going on. The very same students you saw who are failing, they are registered students. So if they are failing, they are registered in the university. So they are there for the academic year of 2020. However, they still find themselves sleeping in libraries, in study centers, in toilets in some instances. I mean, not just the University of Wits is on a protest, even CPUT is on a protest of the same issue of student accommodation. Even University of Mpumalanga, their issues are completely different to an issue of affordability. It speaks to an issue of an accommodation crisis, of lack of beds to accommodate these students.
But this is not necessarily a new conversation.
It's not at all.
Yeah, we've had this conversation
before.
But
there's been no solutions to these particular conversations.
What do you think the solution could be to this problem?
Look, we need multiple stakeholders. We need the private sector firstly to comply. We need government to have oversight over some of the like I'm saying, the regulatory policies around universities. If a university is going to charge you 6.5, which NSFAS student living in accommodation of 6.5 will be able to afford that particular facility? NSFAS itself has a cap insofar as how much accommodation can be given forth. For instance, University of Mpumalanga currently has a crisis because NSFAS says they can only pay up until the highest amount of your internal residence. In this case, their internal residence charges 2.6. So now they only have 800 beds and plus minus 5,000 odd students. All of those students cannot be accommodated in those beds. The minute you begin to go and look for accommodation outside of the university, it's only kept at your 2.6, which is the most expensive residence in your university. Now, if you're going to have a company, a non-accredited company, lease out buildings to students and say that, for instance, 6.5, no student will be able to move into that thing because there's an NSFAS cap, there's a policy cap, there's an affordability crisis, what we're experiencing at Wits and potentially at University of Mpumalanga. Now, what do we then begin to do to say, how do you begin to accommodate these very same students? 800 bed, 5,000 students examination, surely you're going to say students must pass. They can't pass under these particular conditions. Not even that, Wusu. You saw the president speak now. Some of these issues speak to issues of accreditation. The university management has accredited buildings that are not sufficient for student living, student study.
So we've had the Higher Education Minister, Dr. Blade Nzimande, calling on the private sector to actually come on board and assist. So you are for his call as well. You support his call.
No, I mean, that's something that's always come from students, and not just the private sector, even government itself. We have many abandoned government buildings that are around, sitting, dilapidating year in, year out. We are calling on government to set aside funds to renovate these particular buildings, to afford for low-costing student housing housing in these various areas.
But what do you think the immediate solution could be to the problem? I mean, the problem is happening now, but I think part of what you're referring to could be long-term solutions. How do we deal with this matter now, once and for all?
I mean, look, an issue of this particular nature is quite simple, and it stems out of the guidelines that came out in December, which we did problematize at SAUS and SRCs, to say when you release these guidelines, you're going to create a homelessness situation for students on our campuses. Allow a student to go find a decent living accommodation space where they see themselves fit to live in that particular space and bring their particular lease agreements to the university and allow government to fund them. Another thing is the accommodation. I mean, if we're able to give student accommodation residents, in-house residents, based on need, and not necessarily on first come, first serve, we'll be able to deal with most of these particular issues, because you have legacy placements in various universities where, because your father stayed there, your father's father stayed there, therefore you stay there. But you find out that that particular student is coming from, just down the road from Braamfontein or whatever suburb in the area.
We've run out of time, but I just want to get your comment really on what is currently happening at the Fort Hare University. The students have been given a 6 p.m. deadline. In 7 minutes, they should vacate the premises. They said they're not going to adhere to that. The Walter Sisulu University, they're complaining of security. They're calling for the resignation of the Vice-Chancellor as well. What's your take on those two institutions?
As a union, we are quite clear on our position. Both Prof. Buhlungu and Prof. Wingley of WUSU must leave. If they cannot be engaging students in a violent manner by bringing in bouncers, refusing to engage with the SRC. Most SRCs are interdicted. As we speak, the SRC at the University of Fort Hare is interdicted. Now, how are you going to resolve student issues when you have a legitimate body that is being interdicted? And it's a common trend across universities. They just recently come from Parliament. Parliament gave an clear instruction, go and engage with the SRCs to find a solution to these challenges on your campuses. Instead, we wake up today with an eviction notice that students must leave. Where must they go to? Some of them come from far. University of Fort Hare is historically black university. Many of them come from poor backgrounds. When you say they must leave at 6, where must they go to? Some of them come from outside the province. Where must they go in this particular situation in a country of high gender-based violence?
Thabo, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We have to leave it at this, but thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thabo Shingange is the South African Union of Students spokesperson, talking to us about the situation really at many of our institutions of higher learning, looking at what is happening at Wits, CPUT as well. You have University of Fort Hare, the Walter Sisulu University, and you've also said the University of Mpumalanga as well.
Mpumalanga is having an affordable
All right, so really that's a very one story that we need to keep a very close eye on. On that note, that's how we come to the end of the Thursday edition of SA Today. We'll be back with you tomorrow, and do you know what it is tomorrow, Peter? It is Friday.
Hey, we have Friday. Thanks so much.